BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everybody had a good Monday and Tuesday. This most recent Tuesday was the first episode of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning in its new format, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you did not see the live broadcast, you can check it out here in the playback section for Black Box Online Radio. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I'm hoping to go live at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time here on Black Box Online Radio on YouTube. And if you want to follow along with true crime discussions, I invite you to check that out. But on Wednesdays, I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved murder mystery. And Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. In this episode, I will be discussing the Jack the Ripper suspect George Chapman, who is one that I've never mentioned before on the channel for this Ripper Wednesday segment. And George Chapman was a real murderer. He was a real serial killer, known as the Borough Poisoner, and he was of Polish origin. And I'm going to be very honest with you guys. I'm going to be talking about a lot of names and places that are coming from Poland. I don't speak Polish. I'm just some guy from West Virginia. So if I mispronounce any of the words, I apologize in advance. But as I was reading through the websites that have shared a lot of info about George Chapman, whose real name was Seweryn Klosowski, I found that ResearchGate, of all places, had a rather interesting write-up about the story. So I'm going to go over to researchgate.net, and this is their introduction to George Chapman. Again, his real name was Seweryn Klosowski. He was born on the morning of December 14th, 1865, in the village of Nagornak near Kolo in part of Russian-occupied Poland. He died 38 years later as George Chapman after changing his name on April 7th of 1903 in London. He was hanged for poisoning 3 of his partners with antimony in a way that was long and painful, but which made it appear as if they were dying of natural causes. What is rather unusual about these murders is that there were many witnesses to the way that they were carried out. Antonio Klosowski was 30 years old, and his wife Emily, 29, and their son was Seweryn. That's George Chapman. They were Roman Catholics, and Antonio was the village carpenter. Doesn't that just sound like a story that is almost worthy of Pinocchio? When he was 7 years old, on October 17, 1873, Seweryn started primary school, which he attended for 7 years, leaving on June 3rd of 1880 with a good final report. Later that year, on December 1st, he was apprenticed to Moshka Rappaport in Zvolin, and that was 90 kilometers south of Warsaw. Rappaport would train him to be a feldsher, which was an occupation that combined the roles of barber and minor surgeon. This qualification would allow him to perform small operations by himself or to assist major surgery that was carried out by a fully qualified surgeon. In the summer of 1885, when he was 19 years old, Seweryn left Zvolin and, armed with a good reference from both his employer and a local doctor, he set off for Warsaw with the idea to become a fully qualified surgeon. To finance himself through his studies, he took a job as an assistant barber surgeon in the suburb of Praga, and that October he enrolled for a 3-month course in practical surgery at the Hospital of Infant Jesus nearby. In 1886, Seweryn took a job as an assistant surgeon to Dean Mushkovsky and continued to work there until November 15th of that year, that's 1886. The following month he came of age, and that allowed him to apply for a passport, and he was also allowed to sit on through the entrance exam for the degree of junior surgeon at the Imperial University. One more time, that was from ResearchGate, written by John Emsley, just citing the source. And this is something that provides an enormous amount of information in relation to Jack the Ripper, because Seweryn Klosowski is going to go to England, trained as a barber, trained as a surgeon. Sounds very similar to that of Aaron Kosminski, another Jack the Ripper suspect, although it appears that Klosowski might have actually had some more impressive medical knowledge. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that not only attacked women and murdered them, but he also mutilated the victims. And the reason why so many people think that Jack the Ripper had to have been a doctor or a butcher or somebody who had a precise understanding of anatomy is Jack the Ripper cut out the organs of his victims, and he took specific organs. For example, with Annie Chapman, the uterus, with Catherine Eddowes, the kidney, and with Mary Kelly, the heart. Now, some people would dispute that and just think that the Ripper was not really paying attention and he was just cutting the women and putting his hand down and grabbing things. I mean, that's the theory of Patricia Cornwell. But then there are people out there who think that this is not exactly just the work of a layperson who had no idea what he was doing, because this is even in the psychological profile that was created by John Douglas that I was discussing last week on Ripper Wednesday, when he said that he thought that Jack the Ripper could have had an occupation like a mortician's assistant or a butcher, somebody who would have had anatomical knowledge. And Seweryn Klosowski, George Chapman, he would have had all of that in place if he had trained as a barber and a surgeon. And I'm going off of a very informal source here, and that is just watching TV growing up. And when I would watch TV about things in the 1800s, frequently you would see this. So like someone who's a barber would be trained in like stitching up wounds, needlework. And when I read about Jack the Ripper, I see things about how barbers were trained as minor surgeons. Like you will even see that stuff if you read about Aaron Kosminski as a Jack the Ripper suspect. They say things like, oh, trained in minor surgery because he was a barber. And I mean, the stuff that I saw on the television when I was a kid, that made it seem more like the barber was doing very, very, very minor things, as opposed to actually performing what I would think of minor surgery would be, which would be almost like small procedures. I mean, like removing a tumor or something like that. No, it's actually probably just things that are very, very superficial could be done by the barber. But again, someone who is familiar with handling blades, someone who is familiar with the human body, and this isn't some guy who just knows how to cut off a mole or a wart or something like that. With George Chapman, he studied at a university. I mean, I'll read that line again. He took the entrance examination for the degree of junior surgeon at the Imperial University in Poland, and then he is going to go on to England. And this is when things get really bizarre for George Chapman. I mean, just reading that stuff about him from ResearchGate, you really wouldn't think that someone is just going to live a perfectly ordinary life and they're going to snap and become a serial killer. I take it back. That happens all the time. No, I take it back. That happens all the time. But what I was saying is, usually there's a cause. It seems ordinary to us, but usually there's some type of triggering effect that would drive somebody to go on to become a serial killer. I mean, because again, he was a real-life serial killer known as the Borough Poisoner, and he murdered multiple women whom he was married to. But JackTheRipper.org also has shared something about him, and that is one of the first things that you'll encounter when you read about George Chapman is a Jack the Ripper suspect, and that is that he was one of the favorite suspects, if not the favorite suspect, of Inspector Abberline, who is one of the more famous names that comes up in the Jack the Ripper readings. And there's even one story that I read that when he was identified, or when he was caught, arrested, and executed, Abberline said something to the effect of, "We've also caught Jack the Ripper." And I'm going to go over to jacktheripper.org and read their write-up for Inspector Abberline's favorite suspect. Seweryn Klosowski, also known as George Chapman, qualified as a junior surgeon in Poland in 1887. Later that year, or early the next year, he came to London and found work as an assistant hairdresser. In October of 1889, he married Lucy Badarewski. By 1890, he was working at a barber shop in the basement of the White Hart pub in George Yard off of Whitechapel High Street. Now, this is 1889 and 1890. This is all after Jack the Ripper's reign of terror in 1888. In 1891, he moved to America, where he established himself as a barber in Jersey City. I know this is not really the most important thing, but I just have to point out that so many Jack the Ripper suspects have a connection to America, whether it's Robert Graysmith writing his book The Bell Tower saying that he thought Jack the Ripper moved to San Francisco, or you have other examples of Francis Tumblety being, well, Jack the Ripper, the American serial killer, is even something that gets attributed to him. Or just, I mean, how about Carl Feigenbaum also moving to America, and even George Chapman? I mean, let alone, we could go on and on with these lists of suspects. Thomas Neal Cream, that's another one that just came to mind. And what it sounds like is, it was actually much easier to travel across the sea. Let's say, for example, you were a Polish immigrant, you could move to England and move to America, and you wouldn't have to go through this long, tenuous visa process that some people go through now. Okay, so George Chapman moves to America in 1891, where he establishes himself as a barber in Jersey City, and following a violent argument with a now pregnant wife, she returned to England on May 15th of 1892 and gave birth to a baby girl. So then, a few weeks later, George Chapman also returned to London, and the couple briefly reunited. But in 1893, he found another woman who was named Annie Chapman, and they lived together until 1894. And it appears that JackTheRipper.org even has a note about that, saying that Annie Chapman was the name of one of the Jack the Ripper victims, but it appears that it is purely a coincidence that he found a woman in 1893, 5 years after Annie Chapman's murder, who also had the name Annie Chapman, and they lived together until 1894. George Chapman, however, acquired a lasting keepsake from the relationship, for he adopted the name of the woman Chapman, George Chapman, Annie Chapman. And it seems like he's a guy of Polish origin. Maybe Seweryn Klosowski wasn't a name that was getting over too well with the English-speaking crowds, so he changed his name to George Chapman. And this is also something that people have to realize, that this happened very regularly. Some people might immediately think, oh, well, he was Jack the Ripper before he changed his name, and then after that he changed his name because he's trying to hide his identity. This was done rather regularly, because when I read about true crime cases from the 1800s, lots of people would change their names when they would move to a new country, and you would even see this when you're reading about other Jack the Ripper suspects, people from the 1800s. They used more than one name because, again, things were not very well documented, so you had the liberty to do so. His next lover was named Mary Spink, who claimed to have married him, whom he claimed to have married. However, she died on Christmas Day in 1897. His next wife was Bessie Taylor, and she died on February 13th of 1901, and unperturbed, Chapman married again, but when this wife, Maud Marsh, also died on October 22nd of 1902, her family sought the opinion of their own doctor, who became suspicious. The bodies of his first two wives were exhumed, and significant traces of poison were found. Arrested for murder, George Chapman was arrested and found guilty, and was executed on April 7th of 1903. Following his conviction, there were suggestions in the press that he might have also been responsible for the Whitechapel murders. And to be fair, the Whitechapel murders went from 1888 to 1891. Some people actually believe that they began in 1887, say perhaps with the murder of Emily Horsnell, but I digress from that. So, a journalist from the Pall Mall Gazette sought the opinion of the Inspector Frederick George Abberline. Abberline admitted that he had never harbored any suspicions against Chapman in relation to Jack the Ripper until the Attorney General had made his opening statement at the trial. Remarkable coincidences. Since then, however, he had been so struck with the remarkable coincidences in the series of murders that he had not been able to think of anything else for days. The Gazette also quoted Abberline as having observed that there are a score of things that make one believe that Chapman is the man. These are that, having studied surgery, that stood out to me as well. I'm going to read through the whole list, but just the fact that, okay, this guy has surgical experience, but maybe he's not a world-class medical surgeon, but he has surgical experience. That is something that stood out. The Whitechapel murders having been in the work of an expert surgeon, according to Abberline. Well, I disagree with that, and I think a lot of people disagree with that in 2024. Abberline was also struck by the fact that Klosowski's arrival in England coincided with the beginning of the murders. I also think that there's something reasonably intriguing about that. It's worth considering. But if you guys have listened to Black Box Online Radio for a long time, you'll know that I have said this in the past. I don't want to hear about what somebody did not do, because as we go through the list of suspects, we're going to find that a lot of people might not have been around in 1887, and they can't all be Jack the Ripper. So, back to the list here. And so he comes to England when the first murder takes place, and then when he goes to America, similar murders were perpetrated after he landed in America. Well, you really have to be more specific than that, and also, America is going to have a large population. There are going to be numerous murders. You could tie this in to a lot of different Jack the Ripper suspects, and as I already said, that multiple Jack the Ripper suspects have connections to America. And if you'd like to follow along with all of these Jack the Ripper discussions, I do a segment every Wednesday. This one you're listening to now, Ripper Wednesday. And you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And you can also go through some of the links in the description box. And one of them is BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88. This allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. Although George Chapman arrived in London around the time of the murders, so did thousands of other immigrants. That is not a quote from Inspector Frederick George Abberline, that's from JackTheRipper.org. Alright, so they're on the same page with me. That's not enough. It makes you suspicious. It's kind of like the spine-tingling feeling, wait a second, what if? But that is not enough to say that he actually was Jack the Ripper. Thousands of other immigrants arrived in England in 1887. Chapman didn't begin working in the White Hart pub in George Yard until 1890, 2 years after the first murder. Yeah, but all you really need to know is, was he in America, or was he in England, or was he in Poland? Those are the important things. Who really cares where he was working? Although the murders did cease once Chapman had left for America, this could have easily been a coincidence. Well, somebody who has pointed this out, again, was John Douglas in his psychological profile, thinking that the murder of Mary Kelly was the final crime committed by Jack the Ripper. Now, for somebody like John Douglas, George Chapman would absolutely not be his suspect, because George Chapman is going to go on and become a serial killer in his own right after Jack the Ripper, murdering 3 of his wives with poisoning, antimony poisoning, and going on to become the Borough poisoner. And this is something that I just have to address. This is almost like an elephant in the room, or this is something that makes people doubtful about George Chapman as a Jack the Ripper suspect. He murdered 3 people. They were his wives, and he did this by poisoning them. He's the Borough poisoner. Jack the Ripper didn't do that at all. As I said, Jack the Ripper either stalked women or attacked women. He might have blindsided them as opposed to stalking them, but he's attacking women, and he's mutilating their bodies. And what somebody said, it might have been on casebook.org, someone's writing this up, and just saying that, now if this guy were Jack the Ripper, why isn't there an ounce of similarity in the way that he committed the murders that he was convicted for, and the crimes of Jack the Ripper? And I have to confess, I am extremely doubtful of things like that. I become very skeptical of someone's involvement. This guy's a serial killer, but his MO is completely different. And I think the only way that you can reconcile that and actually put the theory together is, oh, well, he changed the way that he was committing the crimes because after the murder of Mary Kelly, he was either experiencing some type of shift in mental energy, or he was afraid that he was going to get caught, or he began thinking about a different way that he was going to commit crimes. I mean, it is possible for a serial killer to start out one way and then end up a different way. It is possible, but there's usually a pretty good reason, and with George Chapman, I'm really not convinced of that. And JackTheRipper.org, was he Jack the Ripper? The major objection against Chapman is that who could brutally eviscerate his victims with the frenzied violence shown by Jack the Ripper, and it's highly unlikely that he would have turned to poisoning. Okay, here's something else, though. He poisoned his wives, and these are very specific targets, and you would also have to prove to me that, or demonstrate that, there is some reason why he would go from attacking women that he was not married to, or, you'd have to prove that he had some type of relationship with them, or that's the stuff that I would expect. You don't have to prove it, I take it back. But I would expect that he might have had some kind of connections with Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman and Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes and Mary Kelly, and that's what I would expect from some guy who is murdering women whom he is intimate with. And I just don't know if there's any evidence that supports that. Oh, you can string together a theory, you can make a hypothesis. We're talking about conjecture. You can do that until the cows come home. But as far as what actually happened, I think that there's going to be insufficient evidence to support that. And there's another source out there called headstuff.org, and this is a website that I had never heard of before. And I always like finding new websites because it gives us the opportunity to look at different sources and different writers. And they have a page on Seweryn Klosowski, aka George Chapman, American Murderer. And this is written by Kieran Conliffe, just citing the source. And it says that George Chapman's original plan was to move to Warsaw and get a job as a barber assistant and surgeon. When he turned 21, he was able to sit through the examination at the Imperial University to study surgery. He passed his exams, but for unknown reasons he dropped out of the university. In 1888, at the age of 23, he emigrated to London. Seweryn's studies may have been interrupted by women troubles, as there are reports that a young woman with 2 children followed him to London, so if he managed to persuade her, he would not support her, as she seems to have disappeared from the scene quite swiftly. And I would just kind of like to reiterate that. I know you guys can probably get the gist of it, but saying that, well, why did he sit through the exams at the Imperial University and then go to London? Did he get somebody pregnant back in Poland and he tried to run away from the situation? I mean, like, I don't know. I mean, really, I'm not sure. That makes sense, but again, is that what really happened? Okay, so then he goes to London, and perhaps because of this, he began to use the name Ludwig Zagowski, and first worked as a hairdresser in Bethnal Green, but soon moved to work in a barber shop and surgeon's shop under the White Hart pub. Well, now this says 1887, but as we just read that he didn't start working at that pub until years later. Martha Tabram was a 37-year-old prostitute who was found dead on August 7th of 1888 just outside the White Hart. She had been stabbed 39 times. And again, that most likely wasn't, or George Chapman most likely was not working at that pub at the time. She had last been seen with a client who was a soldier, though he was never identified, and this was the initial avenue of investigation. By the end of September, though, the papers had relabeled her as one of the first victims of Jack the Ripper. And as I said on previous episodes, I think there's an 80% chance that Martha Tabram was killed by the Ripper. As such, given her place of death and the fact that this fits the profile, the police had decided that the killer, possessing surgical skills and was conveniently foreign, and Seweryn Klosowski, or George Chapman, was interviewed, and he was soon discarded as a suspect, though Inspector Abberline, who headed the investigation, would later say that he had considered him certainly guilty. Why the inspector might have said that will come later. And we already know why. We've heard Abberline's comments, but this almost just seems like they've pre-chosen a suspect and they're just trying to vilify him and make the pieces fit. That's also an absolute no-go. In 1889, Seweryn Klosowski married a Polish girl named Lucy Badewski. Excuse me, I told you I would mess up the names. Whether he had married her in Poland and left someone else behind and committed bigamy, it is unclear. The pair met in a club for social engagements, and they were both Polish immigrants, and they got married. After that, Lucy found out that she was pregnant. By now, George Chapman had his own barber shop and had stopped using the false name of Ludwig, possibly due to the investigation by the police. No, it says possibly due. I wish they had just left that out, because if you don't know why he stopped using that name, then you just don't know. Their son died, though, and that was sadly a common occurrence at the time. This may have been what prompted him to move to America. Alright, so, I think that the long and short of this is that George Chapman has some things going for him, and some things that are against him for being a Jack the Ripper suspect. He would have been 23 years old at the time of the murders, which again is shockingly similar to that of Aaron Kosminski, another Ripper suspect, who is again from Poland, who was a barber, 23 years old. And I think, though, that this guy, George Chapman, Seweryn Klosowski, was a real murderer. I think he was a real serial killer, but he just seems to be committing the crimes in different ways than that of Jack the Ripper. And we even had this in the discussion on the suspect William Henry Bury, when he murdered his wife and he stuffed her into a box, and it's just noticing the differences between the crimes, and it's like the Ripper simply did not do that. And you might be thinking that people can commit two sets of homicides in different ways. Like, people could commit the homicides in 1888 in a different way and the homicides in the 1890s a different way. Serial killers can change what they do, right? Yes, but only looking at the facts. These crimes happen this way, and those crimes happen that way. And as of now, I have to state that they are different. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I think we're going to find out that Seweryn Klosowski, a.k.a. George Chapman, was not Jack the Ripper, but there is a circumstantial case that has been made for him, and it's not purely baseless, and it's not a ridiculous case either. There are supporting points, and he is some guy who has medical knowledge, some guy who is a social deviant, some guy who seems like a proven liar. And here's something else from John Douglas's psychological profile. John Douglas believes that the police would have interviewed Jack the Ripper and he was able to slip through the cracks. Well, Klosowski also matches up with that. But I'm just seeing too many differences and not enough similarities. But what do you think? Do you agree or disagree with anything in my investigation? No, this is not an investigation. Let's be clear. This is my discussion on the suspects. I don't know why the word investigation came to mind. This is my discussion on George Chapman as a Jack the Ripper suspect. And also, I'd like to ask you the challenge question. Do you believe that Martha Tabram was killed by Jack the Ripper? And I'll even throw in another final challenge question. Do you believe that Jack the Ripper moved to America? Because a lot of Ripper suspects have an American connection. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you over there. Until next time,